I grew up in a typical suburban family. There were four of us: my dad, my mom, my older brother Archie, and me. Archie was the star of the family, the golden boy. He was everything parents dream about in a kid: smart, athletic, and effortlessly charming. Teachers loved him, coaches praised him, and our relatives couldn't stop gushing about him at every holiday gathering. If you've ever seen those movies where the older sibling is the overachiever everyone idolizes, that was Archie. And I was the younger, quieter one who lived in his shadow without complaint. For a while, I didn't mind. Archie wasn't just my brother, he was my hero. He taught me how to ride a bike, stayed up late helping me with math homework, and stood up for me when the bigger kids at school picked on me. I admired him so much that I didn't even feel jealous of the attention he got from our parents. To me, he deserved it, but things started to change when Archie turned 18. Looking back, I can see the cracks that had been forming for years, but at the time, it felt like they appeared overnight. My parents had always been strict and controlling, but they ramped it up when Archie started applying to colleges. They micromanaged everything: his applications, his extracurriculars, even his essays. Archie was under so much pressure that it felt like the house could explode at any moment, and then one day it did. I was 15 when it happened. I don't remember all the details of the fight, just the shouting. Archie and my dad were yelling at each other about college, about his future, about how my parents had pushed him so hard that he felt like he couldn't breathe. My mom tried to calm them down, but it only escalated, and then, just like that, Archie was gone. He packed a bag, stormed out of the house, and didn't look back. I remember sitting on the stairs holding my game controller, too stunned to cry as I watched him slam the front door behind him. At first I thought he'd come back, maybe a few days later, maybe a week, but he didn't. Days turned into weeks and weeks into months. The house felt quieter, colder, emptier without him. My parents were devastated, but instead of dealing with their grief, they turned their focus onto me. "You're our last hope now," my dad said one night, his voice heavy with disappointment. "We can't afford for you to fail us too." I don't know if they realized how much that hurt. I wasn't Archie. I couldn't replace him, but that's exactly what they wanted. Everything about my life became about meeting their expectations. I gave up my hobbies, my friends, even my dream of studying creative writing because it wasn't practical. They steered me towards a major they approved of, a career path they considered respectable. I wasn't allowed to make mistakes or take risks. And the worst part? I went along with it. I wanted to make them happy. I wanted them to look at me the way they used to look at Archie. For 8 years, I lived like that, putting their happiness ahead of my own, sacrificing everything I loved to be the person they needed me to be. I don't think they ever realized how much I was struggling, how close I was to burning out, but I kept going because I thought maybe, just maybe, it would all be worth it in the end. That brings me to last year. My parents were planning their 25th wedding anniversary. They put me in charge of everything: the venue, the guest list, the decorations. I was working full time and taking night classes, but I still bent over backwards to make sure everything was perfect. I wanted to give them a night they'd always remember. Big day came. Felt like everything was going according to plan. I stood off to the side, exhausted but proud, thinking maybe this would be the moment they finally appreciated everything I'd done for them. Then the whispers started. It was Archie. After 8 years of silence, my brother had walked back into our lives like nothing had happened. He looked exactly the same as I remembered: confident, charismatic, with that easy smile everyone loved. For a second, I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe this was it. Maybe he'd explain why he left, apologize for disappearing, and we could finally move forward as a family. But that hope was crushed the moment my parents saw him. They lit up like I'd never seen before, tears streaming down my mom's face as she hugged him. My dad clapped him on the back, laughing like a man who just won the lottery. They called him their real son, their pride and joy, right there in front of everyone. And then my mom turned to me and said the words that shattered me. "We don't have to settle for a substitute anymore." Substitute. That's what I'd been to them all those years, a placeholder, a backup plan. My chest felt tight and my throat burned, and I could feel every set of eyes in the room on me. I wanted to scream, to cry, to tell them how much they'd hurt me, but instead I just walked away. That night I sat in my room trying to make sense of it all. I thought about all the sacrifices I'd made, all the times I'd swallowed my pride to keep them happy, and for what? To be discarded the moment Archie walked back into their lives? I didn't sleep much that night, and when I woke up I found something waiting for me on the kitchen counter, a note from Archie. Little did I know that note would change everything. Update 1. I didn't sleep much the night after my parents' anniversary party. You'd think I'd be replaying their words in my head, but honestly I felt too numb for that. I was just wondering, had I misunderstood my parents all these years? Had I been fooling myself into thinking I could ever live up to Archie in their eyes? The next morning I dragged myself out of bed and into the kitchen, and that's when I saw a letter by Archie. I hesitated for a moment. Part of me didn't want to open it. I wasn't sure I wanted to hear whatever he had to say, but curiosity won out. I unfolded the note and started reading. It wasn't long, just a few lines, but the weight of it hit me like a freight train. "Hey, sorry about last night. I didn't mean for things to go that way. Just so you know, I'm not back for good. I needed some cash and I knew Mom and Dad would give it to me if I showed up. Thanks for taking the heat all these years. Made it easier for me to stay gone. Don't worry, I'll be out of your hair soon. Archie." I read it twice to make sure I wasn't imagining things. So that was it? After 8 years of silence, my brother waltzed back into our lives, caused a scene, and played my parents like a fiddle just for money. I wanted to laugh, cry, and punch a wall all at the same time. Instead, I just sat down and stared at the note for what felt like an eternity. The more I thought about it, the more my emotions shifted. There was anger, sure, at Archie, at my parents, at myself for not seeing this coming. But there was also relief. For the first time I realized that Archie wasn't some perfect, untouchable person I could never measure up to. He was flawed, just like the rest of us, maybe more so. And as messed up as it sounds, knowing that made me feel lighter. When my parents finally woke up and came downstairs, they were all smiles. They poured themselves coffee, still buzzing from the high of Archie's return, and barely glanced at me. My mom started gushing about how they were finally a complete family again, while my dad joked about how we should cherish this moment. I waited for a pause in their conversation and then slid the note across the table. They looked at me before picking it up and reading. Watching their expressions change was almost satisfying. My dad's face went pale. My mom's jaw dropped. For once, they didn't have anything to say. "You wanted him back so badly," I said, keeping my voice steady. "Well, there you go. He's not sticking around, and now you know why he showed up in the first place." My mom tried to stammer out a response, something about how Archie must have been confused or stressed, but I cut her off. "Stop making excuses for him. He played you, and you let him. Don't act like this is some big misunderstanding." My dad stayed silent, staring at the note like it held all the answers. Finally, he said, "We'll talk to him. We'll figure this out." "Good luck with that," I said, grabbing my keys. "I'm done." And I meant it. I walked out of the house without looking back and drove to a friend's place. She was one of the few people I'd managed to stay close to over the years, despite how isolated I'd been trying to live up to my parents' expectations. When I told her what had happened, she didn't seem surprised. "You've been carrying this weight for way too long," she said. "Maybe it's time to let it go." Easier said than done. Over the next few days, I tried to figure out my next move. I wasn't ready to cut ties with my parents completely, not yet. But I also knew I couldn't keep living under their roof, bending over backwards for their approval. I started looking at apartments and jobs in other cities, anything that would give me a fresh start. Meanwhile, my parents were in full damage control mode. They tried calling me several times, leaving voicemails about how they needed to talk. At first, I ignored them, but eventually, I picked up just to get it over with. My mom sounded frazzled more than I'd ever heard her before. She asked me where I was. I said I needed some space and I was fine. They told me they didn't mean what they said at the party. It was just the heat of the moment. Look, she said, her voice shaking. We didn't mean what we said at the party. You know that, right? It was the heat of the moment. We were just so overwhelmed seeing Archie again. Overwhelmed enough to call me a substitute? I shot back. There was a long pause. We didn't mean it like that. Then how did you mean it? I asked, my frustration bubbling to the surface. Because that's exactly how it came across. My mom started to cry and my dad took the phone. We'll fix this, he said firmly. Just come home so we can talk. But I didn't want to go home. Not then, maybe not ever. Instead, I told him I needed more time and hung up. A week passed and Archie disappeared again, just like he said he would. My parents were devastated again, and I'd be lying if I said I didn't feel a small sense of satisfaction. But it wasn't enough. I realized that no matter what Archie did or didn't do, my parents' approval wasn't something I could ever count on, and honestly, I wasn't sure I wanted it anymore. The thing is, when you spend so much of your life trying to please other people, you lose track of who you are. I didn't know what I liked, what I wanted, or even who I wanted to be. All I knew was that I couldn't keep living the way I had been. So I started small, signed up for a writing workshop, something I'd always wanted to do but never felt I had time for. I reconnected with old friends, people I drifted away from because I was too busy trying to meet my parents' impossible standards, and I stopped answering their calls every time they tried to guilt me into coming back. It wasn't easy. Part of me still felt like I was betraying them, like I owed them something for everything they'd done for me, but another part of me knew that I deserved better. Better from them and better from myself. Looking back, I wonder how things might have been different if my parents had treated me like my own person instead of a backup plan for Archie. Would I have stood up for myself sooner? Would I have chased my dream instead of theirs? Or maybe the real question is, why do we let the people who are supposed to love us the most have so much power over how we see ourselves? Update 2. The weeks that followed were a strange mix of freedom and uncertainty. After walking away from my parents' house, I'd half expected them to pull some dramatic move to drag me back. But they didn't do anything to reach out to me. It was quiet, eerily so, and I wasn't sure whether to be relieved or insulted. I'd found a small apartment in a different part of the city. It wasn't much, just a one-bedroom with creaky floors and walls thin enough to hear my neighbours argue about whose turn it was to walk the dog. But it was mine. Moving in was a surreal experience. I'd never lived alone before, and suddenly I was surrounded by silence. No constant stream of parental expectations, no reminders of everything I wasn't, no invisible comparison to Archie hanging over my head. For the first time, I had room to breathe. The silence, though freeing, left a lot of space for my thoughts to run wild. My parents were still on my mind, despite my best efforts to push them aside. A part of me felt guilty for how things had ended. Wasn't like I wanted to cut them out of my life entirely. I just needed them to understand that I couldn't keep being what they wanted me to be. Whether they'd ever grasp that was another story entirely. As for Archie, his brief reappearance felt more like a fevered dream than reality. I still had his note tucked away in a drawer. Every so often I'd pull it out and read it, trying to decode his intentions. On the one hand, it was maddeningly clear. He came back for money and left as soon as he got it. On the other hand, I couldn't help but wonder if there was more to it. Did he feel guilty about leaving all those years ago? Was this his way of trying to make amends? However clumsy and selfish it might have been, or was I just giving him too much credit? With time, I started to rebuild my life. I focused on the small things, setting up my apartment, reconnecting with people I'd lost touch with, and exploring interests I'd sidelined for years. I signed up for a creative writing workshop, something I'd always dreamed of doing but never felt I could justify. Sitting in that room with strangers, sharing my work, hearing theirs, felt oddly therapeutic. It reminded me that I was more than my parents' expectations, more than the shadow of my brother. But the process wasn't all smooth sailing. There were days when I questioned everything. Had I overreacted by walking out? Was I being selfish for wanting space? It didn't help that my parents had started sending emails, each one a carefully crafted mix of guilt and concern. They didn't outright apologize, but the subtext was there, an attempt to reel me back in without admitting any wrongdoing. One email stuck out to me. My mom wrote about how the house felt empty without me, how she missed our conversations, how she and Dad wanted to find a way to move forward as a family. It sounded nice on the surface, but the part that got me was the last line. "We just need you to understand how much we've sacrificed for you." That sentence hit me like a punch to the gut. Sacrifice for me. Felt like a cruel joke. I spent years twisting myself in to meet their expectations, sidelining my own happiness, and now they were framing it as if I owed them something. Still, I couldn't ignore the pull to respond. Cutting them out entirely wasn't sustainable, and deep down I didn't want to, so I wrote back, and carefully choosing my words, I told them I was open to rebuilding our relationship, but on new terms. No more guilt tripping, no more comparisons, no more treating me like a stand-in for Archie. I wasn't sure if they'd take it seriously, but I needed to set boundaries. Their response came a few days later. My dad wrote back this time, his tone more formal than I'd expected. He said they were willing to work on things, but added that family dynamics were complicated and couldn't be fixed overnight. It was vague and non-committal, but at least it was a start. While all this was happening, I couldn't shake the lingering questions about Archie. Where had he gone? Was he still in contact with our parents? Part of me wanted to reach out to him, but I didn't know where to start. It wasn't like we'd ever had a falling out. We just drifted apart after he left. Still, his sudden reappearance had stirred up feelings I hadn't dealt with in years. I couldn't decide if I wanted to yell at him or thank him for inadvertently giving me the push I needed to leave. A few weeks later, I got my answer in the most unexpected way. I was cleaning out my inbox when I saw an email from an address I didn't recognize. The subject line simply said, "Hey." When I opened it, I saw it was from Archie. The email was short, almost frustratingly so. He wrote about how he'd left town after the anniversary party and wasn't planning on coming back anytime soon. He said he'd heard through the grapevine that I'd moved out and congratulated me on finally standing up for yourself. That line stung more than I cared to admit. Was he being supportive, or was that a dig at how long it took me to take control of my life? Either way, it was clear he wasn't looking for a deep conversation. I debated whether to reply. What would I even say? After staring at the screen for what felt like an eternity, I decided against it. If he wanted to stay in touch, he'd have to try harder than a half-hearted email. In the months that followed, I continued to focus on myself. I started a new job, one that aligned more with interest and the practical career path my parents had steered me towards. It wasn't glamorous, but it felt right. I also made new friends through the writing workshops, people who shared my passion and didn't judge me for the choices I'd made. My relationship with my parents remained tentative. We exchanged emails occasionally, but I kept my distance. They didn't bring up Archie, and I didn't ask. It felt like an unspoken agreement to avoid reopening old wounds. Still, I couldn't help but wonder how things might have been different if we'd all handled the situation better. If my parents had treated me like my own person from the start, if Archie had stayed instead of running away, if I'd stood up for myself sooner. Looking back, I don't regret leaving. It was the hardest decision I've ever made, but it forced me to confront parts of myself I'd been ignoring for years. For the first time, I felt like I was living for me, not for someone else's expectations. But that doesn't mean I've stopped asking questions. The one that haunts me most is this: how much of our happiness should we sacrifice for the people we love? Where do we draw the line? Update 3. After months of trying to find a balance between rebuilding my life and managing the fragile connection with my parents, I reached a point where I was no longer consumed by what happened during their anniversary. The anger, while still there, had dulled into something quieter, something that didn't weigh on me as heavily anymore. I'd come to terms with the fact that I couldn't change the past or control how my parents saw me. What I could do was focus on the present and build a future I could be proud of. Life started to settle into a rhythm. My job, though not the one my parents would have approved of, brought a sense of fulfillment I hadn't expected. The writing workshop I joined turned out to be a getaway to a community of creative and supportive people, many of whom had their own complicated family stories. It was refreshing to talk to others who understood what it felt like to break away from familial expectations, even if their situations weren't exactly the same as mine. My relationship with my parents, on the other hand, remained at arm's length. We were in contact sporadically, an occasional email, holiday greeting, but the connection felt shallow, like neither side knew how to bridge the gap without dredging up old wounds. I didn't push them for more, and they didn't press me either, though I couldn't help but wonder what was going on in their minds. Were they regretting how they treated me, or had they written me off as the rebellious son who walked away? I doubted I'd ever get a straight answer. As for Archie, I didn't hear from him again after his email. Part of me was relieved. He'd always been a wild card, and his brief return had caused enough chaos to last a lifetime. But another part of me was curious. What was he up to? Did he ever think about the mess he left behind? Or had he moved on without a second thought? I didn't have the energy to reach out and find out. Then, out of nowhere, everything changed. It started with a package that showed up at my apartment one day. I wasn't expecting anything, so when I saw the box on my doorstep, I assumed it was a mistake. But when I checked the label, my name and address were correct. There was no return address, just a stamp from another state. Intrigued, I brought it inside and opened it. Inside was a small pack of papers, a handwritten letter, and an envelope stuffed with cash. The handwriting on the letter was unmistakable. It was from Archie. My stomach sank as I read the first few lines. He wrote about how he'd been thinking a lot about the choices he'd made, how they'd impacted not just me, but our family as a whole. He admitted that showing up at the anniversary party had been selfish, a way to manipulate our parents into giving him money without considering the fallout it would cause. He said he hadn't realized just how deeply it would hurt me until afterwards, when he saw the aftermath from the sidelines. The cash, he explained, was the money he'd taken from our parents, returned with interest. He said he couldn't keep it on his conscience and felt like he owed me the chance to see that he was trying to do better, even if it wasn't enough to undo the damage. He ended the letter by saying he didn't expect forgiveness or even a response. He just wanted to do what he could to set things right before moving forward with his life. I didn't know how to feel. On one hand, it was a relief to finally have some kind of acknowledgement from Archie, a validation that I hadn't been imagining or exaggerating the impact of his actions. On the other hand, it felt like too little too late. He spent years running from the consequences of his decisions, and now, when I was finally starting to heal, he was trying to make amends. It was hard not to feel cynical about the timing. Still, the gesture was more than I ever thought I'd get from him, and it left me with a decision to make. Did I want to open the door to a relationship with Archie, knowing how complicated and fraught it could be? Or was it better to let sleeping dogs lie and focus on the life I was building for myself? While I mulled it over, I decided to use part of the money to do something I'd always wanted but never felt justified spending on: travel. I spent so much of my life tethered to the expectations of others that the idea of going somewhere new just for myself felt both thrilling and terrifying. I booked a trip to a city I'd always dreamed of visiting, packed a bag, and set off with no real plan beyond exploring and soaking it all in. The trip was transformative in ways I hadn't expected. Being in a new environment, surrounded by strangers and free from the baggage of my family, gave me a fresh perspective on everything I'd been through. It was a reminder that the world was so much bigger than the small bubble I'd been living in, and that my worth wasn't tied to anyone else's perception of me. For the first time in years, I felt genuinely happy. When I returned, I felt lighter, like a weight I hadn't realized I was carrying had been lifted. I decided it was time to take one last step towards closure with my family. I wrote a long letter to my parents explaining everything I'd been feeling, not just about the anniversary party, but about the years of pressure and comparison that had led up to it. I didn't hold back, but I also tried to be fair, acknowledging that they'd likely had their own struggles and fears that shaped their behavior. I ended the letter by saying I was open to rebuilding our relationship, but only if they were willing to meet me halfway. Their response surprised me. My mom wrote back first, saying she'd read my letter several times and was still processing it. She admitted they'd made mistakes and said she wanted to try to move forward in a way that respected my boundaries. My dad followed up a few days later with a shorter message, apologizing for the ways he'd hurt me and saying he hoped he could start fresh. It wasn't perfect, but it was more than I'd expected. As for Archie, I still hadn't decided what to do. His letter and the money were a step in the right direction, but I wasn't sure I was ready to dive back into a relationship with him. I did eventually send a short reply thanking him for his honesty and saying I appreciated the effort he was making to set things right. Beyond that, I left the ball in his court. If he wanted to rebuild something, he'd have to show me that he was serious about it. Over time, things started to fall into place. My parents and I began to reconnect slowly with regular phone calls and occasional visits. I stayed firm on my boundaries, and to their credit, they respected them. Archie remained a distant presence, reaching out occasionally but keeping his distance overall. It wasn't the neat, happy ending you'd see in the movie, but it felt real. Looking back, I'm proud of how far I've come. I've learned that sometimes the best thing you can do for yourself is walk away, even if it means leaving people you love behind. It's not easy. It's not always clean, but it's necessary if you want to live a life that's truly your own. Stay tuned for more stories from Our Girl Relationships.